Welcome to Some Things Considered, the podcast where we are obsessed with story. We celebrate creativity and we talk to cool people to find out what makes them tick. I'm your host, Sean Murphy. I'm an author. I direct the Center for Story at Shenandoah University, and I run the nonprofit 1455 Lit Arts. For more about me and what I do, check out seanmurphy.net. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Some Things Considered. This is the podcast where we are obsessed with story. We celebrate creativity. And my mission in life, aside from reading and writing, is to find interesting people to have discussions about how story and narrative work in their life. Fortunately, there are so many people that fit this bill that I'm seldom at a loss. But every now and then there's someone that comes along where I beseech them to come talk to me. And today I'm very honored that Ed Simon has responded positively to my plea that he discuss an amazing essay that he just wrote. Let me introduce him. We'll introduce the essay and talk about why I had to talk to him today. But and as is often the case, I'm taking a very impressive CV and condensing it. But you'll get a flavor for who I'm talking to here. Ed Simon is the Public Humanities Special Faculty in the English Department of Carnegie Mellon University and the editor-in-chief for Belt Magazine and the forthcoming Pittsburgh Review of Books, as well as a contributing editor to the Montreal Review. His essays have appeared in The Atlantic, Washington Post, Newsweek, the New York Times, among dozens and dozens of others. He holds a PhD in English from Lehigh University and has taught as a college instructor for 2 decades. Ed, it's great to see you. Thanks for being here today.
Thanks so much for having me.
It's my pleasure. So I can say very truthfully, I've known of you, I've admired your work for a long time, but it was your recent awesome essay in LitHub, and shout out to LitHub.
Love LitHub.
That's like my daily digest. I can't.
It's so good. I mean, I'm biased, but it's so good.
It's so good. Just replete with amazing things, and makes it so we don't have to seek it out. It comes right to us.
For sure.
But your piece that had me at hello is entitled American Literature's White Whale: Why the Great American Novel is Still Worth Pursuing. So first of all, indeed, hell yeah, let's get into it. Probably the best way to introduce it is let the author talk about what are you doing there, and what can you write that.
So there's like two, I guess, reasons for that particular essay. There's kind of the more grandiose reason, and then maybe the more pragmatic reason. So I'll give the more grandiose one, and that is that I've always been fascinated, at least since I've begun, my studies, which sounds a weird way to put it, but with the idea of what American literature is and how we define American literature. And I'm kind of an unusual Americanist. I have more of the soul of an Americanist than the actual background and training. Because when I was getting my PhD, you had to have a primary specialization and a secondary specialization. So my primary specialization is like early modern British literature, what they used to call Renaissance literature, but now it has this kind of anemic antiseptic name to it. So 1600s, maybe like a little bit of 1700s British lit. And then most people that did that would do medieval lit as their secondary concentration, which was ideally supposed to be something that you could teach, but maybe not publish in, that kind of thing. And my secondary specialization was early American literature, which was unusual, I think, in terms of just administrative things. But my logic was it's all the same people in the same time period. And, whether you're in Boston or London, it's like the 1650s and you're a Puritan and whatever. And early American lit is, I always joke it's like the literature nobody reads. It's the unsexy literature, all of those Mathers writing about the devil. And but what my dissertation really became concerned with in an interesting kind of way, or I thought it was interesting, I don't know if anyone else thought it was interesting, was how we define and think about American literature as something separate from just broader Anglophone literature. Because there's something odd when we talk about American literature, and a lot of it comes out of the disciplinary evolution in the American university system of different departments and so on. But we don't define it by language in the same way national literatures normally are. So that if you took a, French literature class, you might read Rousseau, right? Who's not French. Or in a German literature class, you might read Kafka, or, who's Czech, obviously. Whereas, like, there's this very strict kind of, delineation that is sometimes made historically, and it depends on context, obviously. So I found there to be certain qualities or goals, I guess, like a kind of ethos that's constructed, as they all are, but that makes people think of American literature is somehow different, but also more expansive, maybe as well. So that was, and so I've always had this fascination with like, you know, American epic and like a particular American mode or whatever in that kind of way. So, the whole idea of a great American novel has always been fascinating to me because it is such a hubristic and kind of strange goal, right? But a powerful one. The more pragmatic reason for I wrote this is because April saw the 100th anniversary of Gatsby. And I mean, I'm not a modernist, but like anyone who reads, hopefully I love Gatsby and I wanted to write something about Gatsby. And predictably, Lit Hub had like a whole lot of Gatsby stuff. So my fantastic editor, Emily Firetog, was like, well, do you have anything that's like Gatsby adjacent? And I was like, well, I have this other thing I could do, and I could just kind of gesture towards Gatsby. And that's how the essay ended up coming out.
So thank you for that. And again, on a purely like lit nerd, like right in my wheelhouse, anyone that seriously wants to talk about both Moby Dick and Great Gatsby, I got time for because
Sure.
I beat ceaselessly to the past. I write about those two all the time.
Yeah.
Perfect opportunity to dive into Gatsby. I would say, one of the things that I think is necessarily contradictory, but it makes a perfect kind of sense. Is I think you just articulated wonderfully why the American novel as such is by own definition is uncontainable. But I find
Yeah.
that that's the strength of that because at least in terms of ideals, from the founding, America has been e pluribus unum, like it's diverse. So there isn't a distinct American character. There have been these strains from
Yeah.
Puritanism to capitalism to multiculturalism, etc. So what
Sure.
I think resonates and why these books work and endure isn't because certain professors say you have to read this. It's because they are, as Gatsby so wonderfully does, speak to subsequent generations because these themes have run through American culture. It's not a coincidence that we deal with racism, literal racism in Moby Dick. We deal with literal racism in The Great Gatsby, and it's like, yeah, because we've been wrestling with these things. So I don't even know if it's necessarily that Melville or Gatsby set out to write the great American novel, but they were
Yeah.
able to reflect the times they were living in. It's almost by extension a natural outcome that they are nailing something kind of evanescent but undeniable, indelible about the American character.
For sure. And I think that part of it too is like the novel is wonderfully capable of expressing contradiction in a way that other I mean, poetry does as well, obviously, but
Yep.
you know, it's a multivocal form that is at home with negative capability, which is required to understand a country that is by definition contradictory, right? And I think it's like I don't mean to be like, oh, like Luxembourg isn't or whatever, right?
Yep.
But and certainly any country has its fair share of hypocrisy, but because America, and I talk about this in the essay a bit, is it's a strongly textual nation, right? Like it didn't the United States of America, at least, didn't quite organically evolve in a similar sort of way as other countries, in that it was kind of defined into existence by a like revolutionary fiat, right? And so you think of all of these kind of like grandiose and I think undeniably noble goals or claims in the Declaration of Independence, but then you have like the history of the country itself, which is very different, obviously, right? And so I think that there's a sense of betrayal that is stronger because the promises were so much more utopian. And the novel then becomes the perfect form for exploring that. There's also the way in which, I'm very interested in epic and epic poetry. And there's a great history of like eccentric American epic poems that are mostly not very good. But you can think of like if an epic poem is supposed to express national ideals, so we can name like El Cid in Spain or the Song of Roland in France or whatever. America's like too young to have an epic poem, which is why I think these attempts seem so eccentric, but we kind of grew up with the novel. I mean, depending on how you define the first novel, and it's always like, obviously problematic, and there's a lot of, difficulties with that. We're like within like a century of that becoming really a form. And so I think that we grew up with the novel in the way that like countries or cultures that have an older sense of themselves quite predate it, right?
Yeah, and I think you just nailed something that I don't know if I've ever succinctly grasped. I think you just nailed exactly what we're kind of getting at, which is other countries have already had their history, their turmoil, their ups and downs, their cyclical repetition. So it's almost liberating, I imagine, for a French or British novelist in the 1800s, whereas America is still so new. I think there's an inherent, and I think this is what uh, college classes have lost in the last several decades. They're forgetting that yes, the canon is suffocatingly white, suffocatingly male, and we can and should discuss and deconstruct and debate that. But what connects everyone, in my opinion, from a Fitzgerald to a Melville to a Hawthorne to a Toni Morrison, there's an inherent critique of how we're not reaching the ideals.
Yeah, yeah,
There's something that happens in a novel that doesn't happen on the political stage, or other than movies. Art is getting at that, and the novel is almost a non-identifying articulation of this is what I'm seeing that's so bad. So
yeah, yeah, yeah.
rather than look at someone like Melville and go, "Oh, great, another white dude," it's like
Sure.
this was a white dude that was pushing back against slavery and writing about
Yeah,
a multi-diverse cast of characters and humanizing them. So I think
yeah.
there's this inherent criticism that we maybe have lost by focusing on the gender or the race and saying what connects all these different novels, and it is this persistent lack of identification with the prevailing kind of hegemony of the time.
I think that makes a really good point, and it also, I think, distinguishes it as well from the role of epic poetry, which was always explicitly propagandistic, right? I mean, you read like the Aeneid or something like that's, the Emperor Augustus is great, right? You
Yeah.
read Edmund Spenser's Faerie Queen, and I don't recommend it, but you do, right? And it's like, oh, Gloriana, Queen Elizabeth, the Fairy Queen. It's there to, it's part of an act of nation building, empire building, really.
Yes.
Whereas, as imperial as the United States has obviously been, I can't think of any actual claimant to the great American novel that is bullish on the United States, right? Like the great American novel, by definition, is not supposed to be propaganda for Washington, right? And I think you express it. So I mean, like rereading Gatsby 100 years later, like Jesus, is that a relevant book right now? You have everything in it. I mean, you have not just the kind of self-creation themes, right? But the kind of like the wages of wealth disparity, the way in which the wealthy treat the poor. You have like a kind of simmering racial and ethnic undercurrent there. You have in Buchanan the white supremacist character who comes
Oh,
across like a Proud Boy in like 1925, right? And so I think that like, I mean, that's not as much as like high school kids maybe misread it, understandably, and
yeah.
in a very evocative way, right? This kind of like, ooh, Roaring Twenties sort of thing. The book is like prophetically concerned with failures in America, but then it also underscores that promise as well. Like I think you always have to have that kind of like, ooh, here's what it's supposed to be or what it could be, and then here's what it actually is.
Yeah, in fact, I was obsessed with the centennial, and I wrote a big piece on my Substack about celebrating the Great Gatsby, but I also put a piece on Facebook, kind of semi-jokingly, but I put the dialogue from Tom that's early in the novel about the book you need
Oh,
to read, and I was like,
yeah.
overheard at a recent MAGA convention.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Actually, it's from the Great Gatsby 100 years ago, and that's my attempt,
Yeah.
as a never mind as a reader and critic, but as a sometime professor, an advocate for the novel to make people kind of the shock of recognition. Like, remember, this is what novels can do. This is what literature does. This is what art does
Yeah,
more consistently and arguably better than other forms of criticism, which if you read nonfiction, which I do and I write, but it's inevitably tied to its times because you're responding to the news. These,
sure.
I think, are timeless. And you have to always say timeless, but they don't
Yeah, yeah.
become, they're not just anointed timeless. They are timeless because they have, through the quality of what's been done, stand up to repeated readings. And I think that's why some novels that were considered great at their time um, haven't endured. I think it's partly because of the Academy and trends and tastemaking, but it's also because they were too tied to the times in which they were written.
Yeah, and I think too, like a lot of, a lot of these books are kind of in networks of influence where it's not just like, you know, the number of people who read them, but also like who read them, right? It's like that old joke about the Velvet Underground only sold 1,000 albums, but everyone started a band, right? And
Totally.
I mean, Moby Dick's a funny case because it kind of comes back in the 20s, really. But I mean, it's sort of you know, everyone has read The Gatsby, I imagine. I don't know if I had to break it down. I would imagine I don't know. I mean, everyone's been assigned it at least.
That's
It's
right.
millions and millions of Americans have read Gatsby at the very least. I mean, I know it's still like a kind of high school canon, favorite. And so it kind of haunts our imagination. Like, I mean, I agree with you. I think there's qualities that are essential to the book. Like, I'm not just trying to say it's like, you know, like I think it's a better book than other books, in some ways. But I also think it's just it looms so large in our imagination, it kind of de facto becomes it. I mean, that's one of the things with the great American novel is it doesn't really make sense to have a great American novel that's just in a drawer and no one ever reads it. Like it's created in the community of readers as much as it is on the page to an extent.
Yeah, and one of the things that I also, of course, loved about your essay is that we're at a point, quarter of the way through the 21st century where I no longer am super concerned about what is the great American novel. It's the
Yeah,
fact that we are able or willing to still have that conversation that then leads to recommendations, reminders that you should
sure.
visit this work or just have the conversation. And so I'm already checking myself because there's so many rabbit holes. Like I'm like,
Yeah,
I need an hour with you on Great Gatsby. I need an hour or two on Moby Dick. But as it relates to your essay, and the rhetorical question is, what can novels do? I was at a talk recently, the great novelist Dina Mengetsu, and he brought up like, I'm asked, or the question comes, what does the novel do in 2025? And my response was everything. And
yeah,
I think that in itself is a political act, it's a patriotic act to remind people we're not saying that you have to start reading novels if that's not your jam, but you're going to get something from novels that you're not getting from Twitter or TikTok or Marvel movies. Like there is a point where these people were trying to engage with these issues. So even if you skim the novel or talk to someone about why the novel matters, you're inevitably having political discussions. So that's
yeah,
a 2 cents in terms of what relevance does the novel have? I think it's a fair question, and I think
yeah.
the younger generation, our work is to somehow make these works somehow more accessible or provide gateways into celebrating it. But just having the discussion to me is a victory.
And I think that that's one of the things that's so great. It's kind of fun with the great American novel discussion, right? It's like whenever somebody does like a ranking of the top 100 guitar solos or something, right? And I do think the Great American Novel as a concept is like critically more sophisticated than that. But I think both do something in a very practical way, which is getting people talking about this stuff, as you said. And to that end, I agree with you. Like, I don't, there's no answer to this Henry James novel is a great American novel, but this Nathaniel Hawthorne one isn't, or something, right? Not that I would ever say it that way at all, anyhow. Um, but I think that as a measuring stick, right, as an ideal, and that's part of what I want to talk about is like, I don't think there's an answer to it at all, but I think the idea is useful. And we talked a little bit before you started recording. One of the things that I really enjoyed is I thought that, and I haven't checked recently, so maybe it's different now, but the comments underneath the article I thought were actually really illuminating and helpful. And there were people who, they if they pushed back where things deserved to be pushed back on, or they had suggestions. And part of it was people suggesting other things that could be great American novels. And somebody brought up Willa Cather, and I was like, oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, there's all kinds of stuff that like just hadn't occurred to me. And I like that idea of like we get this conversation going about really it's what you just expressed is what can a novel do? And we're talking about what a novel can do in relationship to national life in some way.
Yeah, and I think to take that even a little bit further, for me anyway, and it's very possible it's a cop out, but like the way my sensibility was shaped is that whether we're talking about music or movies or especially novels, it's not just a conversation starter, but it necessarily involves list making. So
Mm.
again, I'll acknowledge that this might be a cop out, but like I'm truly less interested. I think I could and I probably have made a case for Moby Dick or The Great Gatsby, but it's okay, well, if it isn't Moby Dick, what is it? And my answer would always be, well, you start with Hawthorne so you can understand, and you don't even have to take a novel. You could take one of his short stories and say, this was the prevailing, suffocating Puritan mindset. You go to Melville and we're starting to get outside of New England,
Yeah.
and then you go through Twain and you're really seeing the post Civil War racism. Then you're in Gatsby and we're talking about capitalism and people that work in buildings. Then you're going all the way, up to Morrison and you're
Yeah.
through the past to comment on the future. And then you're getting this catalog of, if you haven't read these books, if you want to understand America from a perspective that isn't heavily leaning on econ, or
Yeah.
here's psychologically how we explain America. I love the idea that a novel or a novelist is saying it's all of these things.
I like that idea is that sort of a history of the claimants to the great American novel gives you a history of America too, in all of its expansiveness, right? Um, and I think that genealogy really works well too, right? Like beginning with Hawthorne, because I can't really think of like, I mean, like a James Fenimore Cooper feels like he's writing sort of like a European picaresque, but just in America.
Yes.
Or like and God bless them, but like Charles Brockton Brown, like that's like they're fun, well, kind of, but they're also boring, large parts of them, but they're very much like that inherited 18th century European Gothic sensibility, which does work so well in an American context sometimes, but like Brockton Brown sometimes just reads like somebody took something from Europe and stuck it in Pennsylvania or whatever. But I think you're right. I think something around the American Renaissance, like beginning then, you can kind of have this story that is told through the like these kind of slices of the great American novel or the project, right?
Yeah.
And I do think it's interesting that you bring up like Morrison's going to the past to explain things because I think that that's a marker, kind of the great American novel today. I mean, that was one of the things people used to talk about Percival Everett's James.
Okay.
This like tremendous rewriting of Huckleberry Finn from the perspective of Jim. And I saw him speak here in Pittsburgh maybe like 3 or 4 weeks ago or something. And it was interesting to me to think about how much of the Great American Novel, it's almost like the Great American Songbook, right? It's like a collection of things you can riff on or improvise in a very jazz-like kind of way. And I think that that's something a lot of younger authors do today, is kind of play with the tools of the past that's there already. It's this tradition.
Yeah. And I certainly don't want to belabor kind of the white male. I mean, that would
Yeah,
be that should be fodder for an entirely separate worthwhile discussion. But I'll risk the attempt of belaboring the point, which is even when we read, say, Hemingway or Raymond Carver, who, when I was coming up, that was
yeah,
the
yeah,
standard. But what is important, and certainly for me, I was still a work. I mean, I'm still a work in progress, but as a bright-eyed young man, I was reading these critiques of toxic masculinity. I was reading even someone like Hemingway, who himself is so like, well, was he a toxic male or was he actually sensitive? It's like, it doesn't really matter because in the
yeah,
we're seeing toxicity, the damage it does, not only to the individual, but the people around them. So even if we just kind of sardonically said, all right, well, let's look at the 20th century white dudes,
yeah, yeah,
Hemingway to Joseph Heller, I think of Catch 22, through, a Raymond Carver, you're not getting a lot of pro-white, pro-masculinity. You're getting how
yeah.
these dysfunctions are handed down through generations, and you're getting insight into this isn't working, so why do we keep coming back to these ideologies?
Yeah, yeah.
And I find within that text a great critique of MAGA, because you're saying this isn't new. There's always this nostalgia for a past that never was.
I think a great example of that, in terms of race rather than gender, is Faulkner, right? I mean, like Faulkner's unequivocally like as a personal guy. I'm sure he was racist, obviously, right? A Southern gentleman of a certain generation, like obviously, but Absalom, and Sound of the Fury, and this whole collection of Faulkner's work, some of the greatest explanation and critique of American structural racism ever written. And he was fully aware of it. I think that's what makes him an interesting figure. I mean, I think Faulkner would also be the first one to tell you that he was not a great guy, right? And probably Hemingway would maybe say something similar about himself too. But I think that's what's so fascinating about a Faulkner. This is a little different from like separating the art from the artist, because like only this profoundly kind of, you know, difficult, complicated, corrupted, contradictory person could maybe produce something like that in the same way. But if you really want to understand a kind of like, you know, mindset of a Mississippian, in a white Mississippian at the time that Faulkner was writing, I mean, you read the great works of Faulkner and you understand how entrenched, deeply entrenched racism has been in American history. And he understands it too, not in spite of being a racist, but in part because he was one, right? And so it becomes complicated, but becomes all the more important, I think, to read and understand those kinds of books and to see what's valuable in them and the moments of beauty that endure in spite of that, right?
Well, that's a beautiful way to put it, for sure. And not for nothing, I'm shout out to Fletcher O'Connor. I mean, I sometimes you can tell, like, we've been in the trenches with these conversations,
Yeah, yeah,
but if someone were to say, okay, then what is the great American novel? I'd say A Good Man is Hard to Find, a short story by Fletcher.
yeah,
It doesn't matter. It's all in there. And again, what I find lacking, with even the best kind of contemporary criticism, it's worthwhile. It has to be done. It's vital for stimulating discourse. But I don't know if I've seen a better articulation. Your shout out to Faulkner, 100%.
yeah, yeah,
But someone could pick up a handful of short stories by O'Connor and say, "Huh, I'm reading headlines from today's, the not just the action, right, the inhumanity and the hatred, the self-loathing, but how
yeah,
things play out on kind of socio-political levels." And Flannery O'Connor, and I think that gets to what we were talking about at the outset, which is, well, what is it about a novel? Because it's fiction, and we need to explain to people it's fiction, but there's more truth there than,
yeah,
because even a nonfiction reporter, as we know now, even reporters at large media outlets have agendas and have blind spots. So
sure.
again, to me, the power of something that Flannery O'Connor wrote is how it illuminates a very human experience that, again, for lack of a better cliche, is timeless.
I think, and O'Connor's a fantastic, I think, example of that too, in part because of her strong theological disposition, right? I mean, obviously, as a very religious Catholic in a Protestant area, and she has this kind of deep intrinsic understanding of original sin, which I've always thought is like remains the most psychologically useful thing in all of Christianity. Um, but she understands it in herself. I mean, her and Faulkner are both people who are capable of self-reflection, which not everyone is necessarily. And I think
Yeah,
O'Connor's an interesting case because she's somebody who, and I know there's been some controversy about her recently,
yeah,
in her private writings, like she said terrible things that were also in keeping with being like a upper middle class white woman from like small town Georgia at the first part of the 20th century. She also publicly was at odds with that. And she acknowledged the contradiction and acknowledged like she wasn't proud of the like
right.
the malignancy in her own soul, but she knew that it was there. There was no like pretending, there was an honesty about it, I think.
Yeah.
And there wasn't like a pretending towards perfection or anything. And that's really the great theme that her literature explores. I just taught A Good Man Is Hard to Find, which is like such a fun story to teach in a course that I'm doing right now about Satan in literature. And so this is kind of our like, Satan not as a cloven-hooved, horned figure anymore, but kind of more metaphorical explorations of it. And that moment of grace thing that is always in O'Connor, so fascinating, like the possibility of all sorts of different people having like a moment of redemption or like a glimpse of paradise, even if they don't go there. And I think I mean, that's why hers is some of the most powerful, like religious writing, obviously, of the 20th century.
For sure. And I'll triple down on the timeless. And again, I can't I
Yeah,
literally have to we have to do this. But so timeless to me, when I read so much contemporary fiction that just doesn't move me or isn't convincing, maybe part of it, and again, this is also a separate conversation, but the writers that want to make it clear because of our contemporary socio-political climate. By the way, this is fiction, and I don't really feel this way, but this maybe we require
yeah,
someone that is conflicted or at least lives among these people. And just I'm riffing, but for instance, when I first read, I was an original hater of J.D. Vance only because
I was too. I gotta get my like, yeah,
when I read
yeah,
Hillbilly Elegy, I was like, I'm not getting anything. Like I'm not feeling any
yeah,
insight into the so-called people. You're using these people as tools. You're not a very good.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
So even if we found out, and this would get into the whole art monsters conversation, but say
Oh yeah,
say it turned out Flannery O'Connor was an unapologetic racist. Yeah, but we're reading the
yeah,
work and what sprang from those internal contradictions and maybe self-loathing illuminate these circumstances and these systemic issues better than someone who knows right from the outset, I'm going to write an anti-racist tone because all my friends are anti-racist and
yeah.
read this. And it's more about the writer, which leaves us cold.
And I think some of it too is like you can suss out when a book is written in bad faith
Yeah.
or written or is a not genuine kind of book. And I think that, it's interesting. I was just thinking about what you said about timelessness with certain books. I think a good way of being grounded in the idea that like even if we can't in a really straightforward positivist Harold Bloom kind of way define unequivocally like this is great, this isn't right, or
Right.
whatever, there is like a deep enmeshing of yourself in very old literature by reading things that are not timeless can introduce you to the idea of timelessness
Yeah.
is so like I go back to Brockton Brown. I feel like I'm being so mean to Brockton Brown. And he's a fascinating kind of figure, but like if you read like Edgar Huntley or Wieland or any of these books, like they're books for specialists, like they're
Sure.
interesting for the time period. I think having undergrads read them if they're learning about like the late 18th century is really useful. But like I'm not going to tell my mom to read Edgar Huntley. I'm just like I think if you what you get out of it is an understanding of how literature changes and its view and context and so on. Um, but it's not the same as a Hawthorne or a Melville. There's something different there. And maybe that changes over time. Maybe 400 years from now, Brockton Brown will like rediscover his audience. And
Yeah.
I mean, that happens.
It totally does.
Um, but I think, you can read things that are very of their time and tell the difference, I guess is what I'm saying. When you find something that is not of its time, that's sort of a little more has a broader view beyond the years in which it was written.
Yeah, and look, and nothing in love, war, and art, nothing is fair. Maybe Fitzgerald didn't even intentionally set out to write something that was kind of future-proofed. But
Yeah, yeah,
like when I was making my notes for this conversation, I was like, I got to throw a shout out to John Dos Passos. There was a guy
yeah,
that was purposefully trying to grapple with the America of his time, and because of that, despite its myriad strengths, there are very good reasons why Dos Passos is not
yeah,
widely read. Because imagine a 21st century student trying to grapple with a world, where someone's talking about radio is cutting edge. It's like that is the definition of it's of its time. And I love the way you put for specialists, like in a lit course,
yeah,
100, if we're going to deal with the early 20th century, we have to read The Jungle. We have to read, Dos Passos trilogy. But that leads me to the other thing that I had jotted down, which was again as a conversation starter. Like we all go through, we can look at it, as an analogy with music. Like Dark Side of the Moon by Pink Floyd, is that their best album? Maybe not. It doesn't matter. Like
Yeah.
why is Dark Side of the Moon appeal? What are the things about it that make it like The Great Gatsby? Like it's not tied to its time the way other great albums. But once you're in that doorway, you're discovering other Pink Floyd, or you're discovering other prog rock, or you've got nerds like you and me saying, well, actually those guys were copying these guys, but it's like
King Crimson the whole way.
it's a conversation starter, and it's
Yeah.
subtly expanding the canon instead of narrowing it, saying, no, if you want to understand 20th century, you read The Great Gatsby and you're done. There's
Yeah.
smug, inclusive snootiness about that, that is inevitably white and male and
Sure.
but by opening it up and saying, actually, you can read these five African American female novelists, like I'm here for that all day.
Yeah. Yeah.
Let's add to the canon. And I think it alleviates the pressure of saying, no, but really, what is the book? It's like there isn't one and it doesn't matter.
And that's one of my things is I always feel like the canon is useful when we think of it as an abstract or an ideal. It becomes very gnarly when we start doing that Harold Bloom kind of thing.
Sure.
I mean, there's a lot I like about Bloom too. I don't mean to use him
Right,
as a
right, right.
straw
Oh
man,
yeah.
but like, uh, I think that that's why I made the comparison of the great American novel to Utopia as an ideal. And it's Russell Jacoby wrote this great book on Utopia. It's one of those like very academic books where it's like three words, and I can't remember Utopia and something else and something else. It's like the Nozick book.
Yeah.
But he
Oh,
says there's a difference between like blueprint utopias and I can't remember actually what he calls the more abstract utopias. But he says the blueprint utopia is like, we're Fourierists in the 19th century, and we will have this like, dorm, and 12 people will live on that side and 8 people here, and this is the number of
right.
hours a day you'll spend. Right? It's like very anal retentive with like defining utopia. And inevitably that becomes hellish because it doesn't
Right.
allow for inconsistency or contradiction or any kind of aberration, right? Whereas if you just have the idea of a perfect society, you can look at the ways in which your own society falls short. And I think that the canon and the great American novel as an idea by proxy are something similar. I think once it's like, no, like the Great Gatsby is the great American novel, end of story. Well,
Right.
that's very limiting, that's very literalist, right? But the idea becomes then the question becomes, what about this novel makes me think of the great American novel, right? It becomes a tool and not just a drawer that you put stuff in or an exhibit case that you put something in.
Yeah, and I think some of this speaks right to the cultural relevance that we're all kind of, as advocates for writing, we're battling an ongoing losing battle. But I just, for instance, like I mentioned Dark Side of the Moon, but like if you talked to somebody about, say, Steven Spielberg and said, well, Jaws is his best movie, no one would feel offended that you were making that choice. It would be, well, that reflected this, and this, and that's why it was timeless. But a very interesting conversation, a respectful debate could occur. Like, I actually
Mm.
think it's more blah blah blah, but there's something about literature itself that is we have to acknowledge that we're already playing on a field
Yeah.
that is very narrow. Which leads me to the other thing. I think I'd be remiss if I didn't. When I'm talking to people or advocating for the novel as a concept, um, the fact of the matter is, we don't need to shit on Twitter or TikTok or reality TV and Netflix. We can look at the fact that based on current environment in America, the narrative as such is largely being driven by CEOs
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
tech bros who who do not have anyone's best interest in mind. So it's a cultural crisis that our artists, who we have traditionally looked at as the outcasts who are shining a light on us, if the most prominent narratives of our time are being written by people who are demonstrably horrific people, I put the blame on myself and say I'm not doing a good enough job expounding on the power of storytelling and good storytelling. So rather than blame, the youth for being
Yeah.
hollow, I say, what can I do to make people read more and understand why this can be both illuminating and satisfying?
Yeah, I think it's interesting too when we talk about like a crisis of literature. Is like in one way, I mean, some of the best stuff I've read has been written in the past 5 years. I mean, there's tremendous talent. Like people will always write and they will always create powerful fictional narratives. And there will always be somebody who will want to read it. But the audience obviously has changed. And I mean, you have to give Gaiman his due, right? Like publishing's a business, it's an industry, and it doesn't always do things in ways that I think are conducive to a creative community of folks necessarily. And we do compete with these kind of actively designed malicious algorithms that divide attention and kind of partition people in particular ways, right? I mean, I know this was a big question, and you've probably come across this. It was in the Atlantic like 6 months ago. And there's an article about college professors assigning shorter and shorter novels because like students can't get through all of like Bleak House or Persuasion or whatever.
Right.
And it's an interesting question because like I mean it was a very anecdotal article, so I don't necessarily know. I mean, I find that like my students tend to read what I assign them, or at least they fake it really well, which is like admirable in its own way, right? And I'm obviously at like a relatively elite institution, so that's maybe a different set of
Yeah.
concerns. But even when I wasn't, you know, I feel like people can break themselves back into reading in a
Yes.
way. But I find it with myself. Like I doom scroll for hours a day. So I'm like a huge hypocrite with this. Like, and I'm
Sure.
like, I should read this new novel. And I'm just on like Reddit, which is like the thinking man's Twitter, right? And I you know, it maybe takes like an hour or so, but once I immerse myself in narrative again, I'm like, oh, okay, I'm back. I can read this like 1,000 page novel or whatever. And it does give you something different to
Yeah.
be, you know, on page 400 of a 1,000 page novel. That's an experience that is not replicatable by
Yeah.
other types of art. It's a unique thing. It doesn't do what drama does. It doesn't do what lyric poetry does. They all do different necessary things, but that's the novel's magical ability, really.
That's right. And I think what we're getting at and what we're kind of hitting on is speaking for myself, I view, the advocation of the arts as not as prescriptive, but as aspirational. And
Mm.
for me, again, I'm very tired of I was at the Barrel House, shout out to Barrel House conference on a panel writing as an act of resistance. And unfortunately, there was a person in the crowd of an older teacher who took the opportunity to point out, like, well, kids don't even read. No one reads poetry and no one reads anything. Like we're doomed. And it was all I could do because I, of course,
Yeah.
treated well, and I would never unload on some. I don't unload on anyone, even on in the internet. But I wanted to say, do you realize like what you're saying was said 20 years ago? It was said
Yeah.
100
Yeah.
years ago. It's going to be said 100 years from now. But at what point are we, as I'll just say, as progressives or as teachers, as writers,
Sure.
are we ultimately content to be at these conferences of ideas and say things like, well, AI is, fucking everything up, or kids don't even read? I feel like the onus has to be on the advocate
Yeah.
to say, okay, how do we meet the younger generation where they are and play rap music or show a clip from a movie or a commercial or whatever?
Yeah.
Say, this is the power of art. This is how storytelling works across mediums. And then there's the gateway drug into a book they might be interested in. But I don't think it's a cop out to say skim Leaves of Grass, skim the Scarlet Letter, see what works for you. But it's like, let's get people that are winnable. And I guess I make the analogy to voters, like, let's maybe not spend
Yeah.
time on people that have shown I'm not changing my mind, and get those persuadable voters. To me, that's just a it's a way to feel invested in the fight and actually have outcomes that might be positive. But I think ultimately the onus is on us to do a better job making a case for this stuff.
You know, I'm glad you brought up stuff like skim Leaves of Grass or whatever, because I think that you bring up a really important part about I think that like the individual you talked about, no, these kids don't read anymore or whatever, right? It's a very joyless understanding of reading. And I was like, if that's how this gentleman defined reading, well, then of course nobody wants to do it the way he's saying it because it becomes like a checklist of things. And our culture does emphasize, I mean, there's like you go on Goodreads, which, I feel like if I say it 3 times in the mirror, it'll appear in my office, right? But like people do those kind of like very like, here's the number of books I read this month, and here's it becomes like dieting or jogging. It's just like another job people have to do.
Yes.
And it like if that's reading, of course, like most people don't want to do that. They already work terrible jobs, right?
Yep.
And I always go back to, and I do it myself, right? Like I'm like, oh, I should be reading a thing, cover to cover, or I haven't really read it. And when I was a kid and I would read, and I was a reader as a kid, I loved reading. I would stack books up from the library, and like if I was looking to buy books or whatever, and I would dip into them and I'd read the thing that interested me. And I might read one chapter out of the middle of a book and nothing else. I might read, and I might love that book. That might be a favorite book of mine. And I only read 10% of that book, right? And I
Yeah.
think something changed in me, and I don't know if it was like academic training or if it was just the culture, but I became like very much like a completist, where it was like if I don't do everything, and I have to focus my attention on just this one thing. And I used to dip in and out of books, and just kind of like inhabit them. So I always try to remember. There's a quote from Francis Bacon, and he says something where he's like, and I'm gonna butcher this, but he's like, some books are meant to be eaten and digested entirely. Some are meant to be sampled. Some are meant to like the dessert is eaten first or whatever. And I
Yeah.
think that that's like that kind of gleeful promiscuity is something that is how people have always naturally read. Like I
Yeah.
think when we say people don't read anymore, like no, this is how people used to read in the past too, and it's how people enjoy reading. And yeah, sometimes you want to read the novel cover to cover, and that's an achievement in its own way. And
Yeah.
sometimes you dip into the anthology, you enjoy it. It's a joyful thing. It's playful,
Yeah.
right? And I think that this very kind of like the students didn't read what's on the syllabus. Well, that's a particular way that you read in a certain context, in a class or something. But that's not why you go to the bookstore or the library necessarily.
Yeah. Well, how I did respond to that person's comment in the moment was you want a surefire way to not get someone to read poetry or a book, put it in front of them and say, you should read this.
Yeah, yeah,
If that's the best case you can make for it, especially remember when you were young and an adult said, just trust me, this is good.
yeah,
But I also think I had a little mini epiphany while you were talking, which was one way to kind of inoculate academics from this very discussion is saying we're not even necessarily elevating the novel. We're talking about why does literature work, what
Mhm.
makes it work. And you and I have both written books. My personal approach is very straightforward. If someone isn't interested in what you're writing, that's your fault.
Yeah, yeah,
Write something, whether it's an op-ed, a short story, a poem, a novel, etc., that is unput downable. And if you achieve that, your work has to make a case for itself. So, yes, Great Gatsby is assigned in every high school class, but the reason some of these books endure is because they make a case for themselves. So I think we can also just separate what are you getting after with this? And it's like I teach people and I've always been an advocate for I want to convert people that aren't English majors. I want
yeah,
you
yeah,
to someone, this might not resonate with you now. Just remember when you're 30 or 40, whether it's this movie or this book or this album, this might speak to you at a later time. That's the power of art. And if we
yeah.
use that in younger people, we're doing our job. So I would actually feel like a failure if I said, I got 10 people to read The Great Gatsby. Did they enjoy it? I don't know.
Yeah, yeah,
I got 10 people to make connections between contemporary music and what Walt Whitman's doing is saying, and going back to the Greeks and saying, this is how people roll. This is
yeah,
how they've expressed themselves. So I guess the good news for me anyway is it's actually lowering the bar. It's like, let's get people in the door any way we
yeah.
can. It's not selling it out. It's an opportunity to then celebrate it.
And I think it's one of the things too, like whenever there's that kind of, literature's dying thing, is I think, well, it's just not true either, right? Like,
Yeah.
I mean, just empirically, independent bookstores have done better in the past since the pandemic than they did in the past like 30, right? Like they're growing ever, like just anecdotally, here in Pittsburgh, mid-sized city,
Yeah.
5, 6 new independent bookstores. They have a vibrant literary community. They have events and readings and book clubs every night of the week. In Pittsburgh, you could probably go to a poetry reading every single night. We've got International Poetry Forum. We've got the Odd Month Poetry Series. We've got City of Asylum Poetry Series. And like, not only that, like people are there. Like, it's not just like three people, doing that kind of thing. I mean, I saw IPF here in Pittsburgh, I went to go see Emily Wilson, the translator of the Odyssey and the Iliad. She spoke to about 400 people and began that talk speaking in ancient Greek, right? And like, there's not 400 classicists in Pittsburgh, right? So like, people want this, people like this, and I think that you meet them where they are, but where they are is already like pretty good, and I think it's some of it's just uh I mean, audiences change and how people consume things change, but like I have complete and utter faith that people will always enjoy literature
Yep.
to some degree because they always have, and it's intrinsic to us. We're
Right.
narrative creatures, we are meaning making creatures, we're
Right.
storytelling creatures. It's just always going to be there. Might not always be in the university, there might not always be universities, right? But there will always be stories and literature in some way.
I love that, Ed, and I think it kind of brings us full circle in an authentic way, which is to answer the direct question, what value does the novel have in 2025, or what use is literature? And the answer is what you just said, which is it's especially during times of crisis, or when for whatever number of reasons people's antenna are more open to um, different voices, different perspectives. This is where literature can come in and meet you where you are, whether you want to dip into a novel or
Yeah.
revisit a movie or read some poetry. This is never a better time. And then we can even step, of course, outside of America and say, and guess what? Not only in American history, but in world history, when there have been crises, whether it's Dickens or Homer, people
Yeah.
have been on the sidelines observing and commemorating these human struggles. And to me, again, it gets back to the very magic word, but not said ironically. Like, it's more inclusive. This is our
Yeah.
humanity on the page. This is connecting races, religions, sexes, genders, and there's a real power in that. And again, I think that can open minds and stimulate discussion.
I definitely think that the novel too. I mean, it was sounds like a Borges quote, but I don't know that it is. That like a person who reads lives like 1,000 different lives, right? Like, I mean, the novel's ability to put you into the head of someone who is not you. There's no other art form that can do that. I mean, I don't know if virtual reality one day does it or something, maybe, but like right now it doesn't, you know? And I think that that kind of feeling yourself intimately in the thoughts of another human being in the way that is made possible by narrative fiction, prose fiction, is it's a type of magic when done really well, right?
Totally. And I have to take the opportunity to be smugly blasé, but I just run against the current of hysteria around AI. I'm like, more of it, please.
Yeah, yeah,
If for no other reason, I think we know from history and our own kind of our own instinct, the more fake, copied, inauthentic stuff that's on offer, the more people will crave, even just as an antidote, original thought, something that was produced.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
So we need to be very cognizant of and address the issues as teachers, as citizens. But to me, AI not only won't replace art or threaten art, it can't, because it's
Yeah.
the antithesis of what art, however successful, art is in this corner and AI is in this corner, and never the twain shall meet. So I find something very refreshing about
Yeah.
there's no threat there.
There's a meme I once saw that said, AI art convinced someone that the soul exists because you look at like an AI image and it can be technically perfect, but you know it's wrong, right? And they were like, oh wow, like shit, I finally like discovered the human soul. And I was like, there's kind of some truth to it, right? Like,
Totally,
yeah,
totally.
it's weird. It's weird. Like the uncanniness kind of highlights how even like bad human-made art, you can encounter the human in it in a way that you maybe without the comparison to be made might not have noticed.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and you say the word human, which leads me to the only other topic that I feel I'd be remiss. I think what you're doing in the essay, the work you do, the books you've written, this conversation today, you're teaching. I mean, you are literally and figuratively an advocate for the humanities. We can't ignore the fact that, first of all, for those of us that are either in those trenches or are
Mm.
paying attention, yes, we're reaching an inflection point of crisis, but there's been a very successful very financially motivated war on the humanities for decades
For
now.
sure.
Again, I welcome the fight because finally the opposition is now exposed, and we're seeing what the stakes are, and we're
Yeah.
into the ability to have free speech, free expression, and teaching. Um, they would say indoctrinating, teaching young minds who aren't going to be lit professors to think and
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
questioning not only authority, right, but textual. Is this politician making a compelling case? Is that market, that product that's being marketed? Why am I not feeling that? And you can understand how to art, how to express why it's not working. But talk a little bit about how you view kind of this war on the humanities and
Yeah.
how you find both the courage and the conviction to keep fighting the good fight.
I think you're definitely right that we have reached an inflection point that feels different from everything in my like career or my lifetime even, right? Like there's always been those kind of naysayers or opportunists or cynics that attack the humanities. And I
Yes.
think they attack it for the reasons that you identified is the humanities teach someone how to not just critically think, but fully inhabit their own personhood in a way, right? Which sounds not doesn't do well for like market driven
Yeah.
education,
Yeah.
but necessary for democracy. And I think there's no mistaking the fact that people started to like believe obviously fake bullshit when they were no longer taught how to like differentiate reality from obviously fake bullshit, which is
Yeah.
why I think why there's that attack on the humanities. I think right
Yeah.
now it seems so daunting and so unprecedented, and just at the financial level. I mean, on all fronts, you see the attack on universities, the attack on museums, the attack like the Smithsonian, the Kennedy Center, the book banning. I mean, it's everything all at once, and at 11, right? Like it's all dialed up. I
Yes.
agree with you. I think that there's a kind of like this is the fight that's supposed to happen. Let's get it out of the way. Like
Yeah.
there's almost a kind of like, well, it's finally here. Like cards are on the table. And so I think that I think there has to be a way for the humanities to like survive and come out the other side. I mean, like if classical learning was preserved by like Irish monks and monasteries, and there's okay, let's find a monastery or something. But I think that like the humanities and knowledge and learning and creativity and discourse and all of that survives because it has to. I don't know what form it's going to look like necessarily. I am heartened that there is like genuine pushback that seems like it has finally emerged. But at the same time, like I can't help but like there's like a deep grief when you see the stuff that's being
Sure.
altered or destroyed. I mean, it's like a cultural revolution we're in the midst of right now in the worst possible way. And I was just reading through lists of like, I mean, you know how like the NEH works, which is like the funding for the NEH is like half of a plane for the Air Force or something.
Right. Yeah.
But the NEH largely gave out funds to state humanities boards, which then funded like local projects. And none of this stuff was like anything that anyone would ever think is particularly, like, oh, I want to have a $3,000 grant to record memories of old people from the Dust Bowl or whatever. I mean, that's the sort of necessary stuff that it does. And like, that's all done. That's all dead now.
Yeah.
And that's the ironic thing is it's really an attack on things that I think a lot of people would think of as very like American in some
That's
sort
right.
of way. So the cynicism of the powers that be going after this stuff is heartbreaking in like a very literal way. But I do think that I think there's another side to the shore. I just hope it doesn't take us too long to swim to that.
I'm as distressed, disconcerted and exhausted as any,
Yeah.
kindred spirit right now. But like we just established, I mean, now at least the cockroaches are out from scurrying behind the cabinets. You
Yeah.
see them, and I think the one thing that America has shown is people might not miss things until you take them away from them, and
Yeah.
it shouldn't come to that. My personal mission is we need to tell better stories as artists, as politicians, so that it doesn't come to this. But
Yeah. Yeah.
this inflection point is do we want to understand history? Do we want to make a world where not only does no one read Moby Dick, but no one's allowed to read Moby Dick? And it's like,
Yeah. Yeah.
do
Yeah.
the stakes need to be that severe? And sometimes the answer, unfortunately, is yes.
Yeah.
I think that is why, now I've got all the time in the world for that fight because we are
Yeah.
talking much less about woke DEI literature, humanities, and we're getting into American culture, the
Yeah.
Constitution, and that's a playing field we win on. That's
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
my feeling.
Well, I always used to joke. I was like, politically, like I was never like an accelerationist, but I was like, I don't know that I have a choice right now. It's sort of that was chosen for us, I think. And
Yeah,
I do think it's fair to think about, like, God willing, when this moment in history has turned, like, how do we build something that is better? And is there a way to build? Because, like, there's no returning to a status quo, and there shouldn't be a return to a status quo. And the status quo is a big part of why we are where we are. But what do we want after the dust is settled? What do we want our country to look like? And I think that that's important. It's
yeah,
actually my next book. Well, I suffer from terminal logographia, so I have a couple things in the irons in the fire. But I'm doing something for IG Publishing, who published my Milton book a couple years ago, and it's going to be released July 4th, 2026. So auspicious day. And it's the basic argument of it is that you have the United States, which is like the real country, constrained by geography and history and politics and whatever. And then you have kind of a more utopian ideal that is America. And that you have instances of American culture that, like, express, like a Moby Dick, that express this at its best, or its most aspirational. So it's like a little vignettes, like 50 little vignettes probably, about different examples of that sort of culture. And it's a very expansive reading of literary texts. I'm going to have music and sports and movies and all kinds of stuff that are in it. I have to write it quickly, obviously, so it can get there out in time.
right.
But it's kind of a culmination of a lot of this sort of stuff I've been thinking about and that we talked about today.
That's awesome. And again, I thank you, because my final question was going to be, yes, we've covered a lot, but how can people, what are you working on? How can people,
Yeah, yeah.
I'll put this in the summary, Ed, but people that are watching this now, they're like, God, this guy's amazing. How can people easily discover you and all the stuff you're doing online and
Oh,
your world?
sure. The best is to just check my website, which is edsimon.org, so I'm an organization, because edsimon.com is run by the Venezuelan jazz pianist of the same name,
Okay.
but who's great, and they should check him out too, by the way,
Right
if
on.
you like acid jazz. But I keep that pretty vociferously updated. So all of my new essays, like day of that they're published, come out there, and my new books are under the books tab there. And then I have a Facebook page too, a public page called, like, Marginalia Ed, I think. If you just look for Ed Simon author, it should come up. But I keep that pretty updated too.
Awesome.
Not the
Well,
photo. The photo's me younger and
oof.
with darker hair, but everything else I keep updated.
That's right. That's
Yeah.
right. Well, listen, Ed. So I thank you at least three times. One, for taking the time to be here. As you hopefully can tell, my enthusiasm has been like trying to ratchet down. We're geeking out, which is what I live for. I thank you for writing that essay, which
Thank you.
I'll return to and share. But also, clearly, you've built a life around doing the work, teaching, writing, engaging, advocating. That's those are the heroes. And I think my final thoughts for today would be, is as corny as it might sound, like, we need to keep the fight going, because we owe it to the people, artists, and citizens that fought equally challenging, if not more challenging circumstances, and left the world with their beauty and their example, the progress that they made. We need to pick up that baton and keep going forward. And a novel is as a
Yes.
distraction or source code for inspiration. It's
I
all.
like that. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me on.
All right. Well, it's my pleasure. We'll see you again, folks. I'll put it in the write up as I always do, but I will give you easy access to get into the world of Edward Simon. Keep an eye on him and his new book. And thanks for checking out Some Things Considered. Again, this is the podcast where, as you can tell, we are obsessed with stories, storytelling, talking to interesting people, and really trying to figure out what makes us tick and why we are united, why we have a lot more in common than not, and we all need to support each other, buy books, go to an event, fight the good fight, and we will not be silent. So we will see you soon. Thanks for checking us out.
Thanks.
Thanks for tuning in to Some Things Considered. Find out more, including how to be a guest, at seanmurphy.net. Reminder, we are obsessed with story and celebrating creativity. Also, we're here to advocate for the arts by any means necessary. Drop us a line, get involved, and support our creatives who are the lifeblood of our culture. I'm Sean Murphy. See you on the next episode of Some Things Considered.